Diamond Lake is a spectacular sapphire blue, with a tawny shoreline ringed by ponderosa pines. The pines there struggled to survive against the scourge of a plague of unseen beetles that insidiously burrowed through the bark and into the cambium, a tree's growth layer where the rings in the trunk are formed. For years, the attack by the tiny army went unnoticed, picking away, weakening a once mighty stand of timber until the trees began to slump into deadfall. A slow, quiet death, unseen, until it was all too late. For Liz Camden, too late happened when she was only 9. Shards of memory returned every time she passed the sign indicating the turnoff to the lake. Liz was always a passenger when this occurred, because she never, ever drove that route on her own. It was a pact she made with herself, a way out of remembering all of it and preventing the splintery, jagged pieces from stabbing at her. Whenever they did, despite her best efforts to forget, the memories assembled themselves into a cracked mirror, and it all returned. Liz's mother, Bonnie Camden, and neighbor, Miranda Miller, planned a day trip to shop in Portland, 3 hours from Bend. Liz's father, Brian, was away on business, though due home that night. Miranda's husband, Dan, a doctor with a thriving practice in town, had been looking for an excuse to take out his new boat while the women were off spending all of our hard-earned money on diamonds and furs. It was a joke, of course. Dan was always one to exaggerate Miranda's spendthrift ways and trumpet his own frugality, except for that boat. He'd wanted one for years. He'd sit on the deck overlooking the Deschutes River and roll his eyes at the tubers who passed by. He wanted a boat with an outboard motor. Why float when you could command the water with an engine's roar? For fishing, Liz remembered Dan telling Miranda when the Camdens were over to celebrate the end of the summer. You can fish from the shore like everyone else, Miranda said. She could always deliver a deadpan line. She had a knack for it. Or she could make her point with a simple gesture, a roll of the shoulder, and what they all knew and loved as the Miranda look. A dart at her target, then away, with a slight smile across her face. Never mean, always effective. I want a boat. I want a new refrigerator. Oh, really? He said. That's what I just said. Liz remembered how 3 days later a delivery came from Hanson's Appliances. The day after that, Dan pulled up in front of the Miller's house with a boat trailer and the apple of his eye. It wasn't new, but the 16-foot Bayliner Capri was the most beautiful thing Dan had laid eyes on. God, I love this boat. I might even sleep in it, he told Miranda as the neighbors gathered to ogle his purchase. Miranda rolled her shoulder, flung her dart. Well, I hope it's comfy because there's no might about it, Buster, then slipped away with her wry smile. She wasn't mad at her husband. Not ever. That's just the way they played. Liz always liked the Millers' banter. Her parents were mostly silent, a quiet and somewhat sweet stalemate. When the chance came to hang out over at the Millers', she always looked forward to it. She knew it would be fun. The trip to the lake was executed like an army reconnaissance mission, which wasn't surprising. In his life before returning to Bend to start a medical practice, Dan had served in Vietnam. He never talked about that experience, at least as far as Liz knew, but his crew cut and the jangle of the dog tags he still wore telegraphed his history without words. Dan was a lean man with sinewy arms who was softened by his ready smile and pretend irritation with all the things Miranda threw his way. As the big day approached, Dan gathered the kids who were not away at church camp, Liz and the Miller's son Seth, both 9, and Liz's older brother Jim, 11, to talk about the finer points of trout fishing and water safety. Dan could be long-winded, and most everything he said seemed pure overkill, but that was the way he was. The blast of heat that week had toasted the high desert.
I guess that's
When
what
thunderclouds rolled in the
got
night
my
before
name,
the
I
big
guess,
trip,
guys.
everyone felt the relief that comes with the promise of rain. The TV
so
weatherman,
no,
a
guys,
glad
that's my
hander with
real
an
name.
endless procession of bow ties,
If you
indicated a
guys didn't
storm
know,
would
my
move
real
quickly
name is
through the area.
Akara, or
And
some
for
people say
once, he was
Akira.
right. The tempest passed through Bend
know.
early Friday morning,
So
slickening the
very fancy
roadways,
name, I guess.
filling the Deschutes and pounding the eardrums of those unable to sleep through the cracks of thunder. That morning, Bonnie and Miranda went out ahead of Dan and the kids. I need to get to Portland early if I'm going to empty Dan's bank account, Miranda said as they drove off. Years later, Liz could still see her mother and Seth's mom as they had appeared when they left in the Miller's
just a
Cadillac.
school uniform, but I kind
They
of
had
wanted
dressed
to do
up
this.
for the occasion. Her mom seldom did that, but that day Bonnie Camden looked like a movie star. Indeed, both women did. They wore new summer dresses. Bonnie had made hers from a butterick pattern she'd found at a fabric store in the town of Sisters. It was a solid sky blue with white piping. Miranda had ordered hers from an expensive catalog from a store in New York. It was white linen that she accessorized with a pale green leather belt. Liz wanted to touch the linen, but she didn't dare. She wondered when she'd be old enough to wear makeup and put on a gold necklace and shoes that clattered when she walked on the stone entryway of her grandparents' house. Of all Liz's scattered recollections from that day, the one of Mrs. Miller and her mother was unique, in that it was the only one Liz didn't mind revisiting. The white Ford station wagon reeked of a sweet, spicy scent when Liz and Jimmy got inside to join Seth and his dad. Cloying, heavy. By the end of the day, the scent had imprinted itself on Liz's brain in the way that the odor of the first alcohol that gets a new drinker really, really drunk can later turn their stomach at the slightest whiff. Yet, sitting there, she couldn't determine exactly what it was. Spice like her dad's tea-berry gum? A sachet in her grandma's drawer? Dan stopped at McDonald's on the way out of town and ran inside while his son and the Camden kids waited. Liz would later remember thinking it was an auspicious beginning to the trip. An Egg McMuffin was a treat. Her mom never let her children eat fast food. She says it isn't good for you, Liz recalled saying to Dan when he handed her a McMuffin wrapped in oily paper. Beer isn't either, Dan said, but you'll drink it anyway when you're older. Liz sat in the front next to Dan. The radio played country music. At the time, Liz, with her Egg McMuffin and not having to sit next to her brother, thought the moment could hardly be improved. Well, at least the fast food was awesome. The smell and country music, not as much. The wipers went on when it started to rain a few miles before the turnoff to the lake. At first, small droplets smeared the brittle remains of dead bugs over the surface of the glass. The droplets grew larger, and then suddenly multiplied into such fearsome numbers that individual drops could hardly be discerned. The pelting water sounded like 100 nail guns hitting the roof. We don't need no stinking sunshine, Dan said, sipping his now tepid McDonald's coffee, which earlier had been too hot to drink. Taking his foot off the accelerator a little, he put down the cup and leaned forward to swipe the inside of the windshield with his fingertips, in case condensation was contributing to the difficulty in seeing the road ahead. Man, he said, glancing at Liz next to him and the boys in the back seat. This is some cloudburst. The wipers fought wildly against the rain, but it only kept coming faster and faster. The car was enveloped by a continuous sheet of water. As the vehicle eased up an incline, Dan lowered the driver's window and looked to the sheer walls of blasted basalt on either side as a guide. Liz couldn't be sure, but later she came to believe she'd been the first one to feel it. A slight rumble. Maybe something was wrong with the radio. Jimmy liked to turn the bass up real high on the dial on their parents' stereo system, but it wasn't the radio. Liz looked at Dan and their eyes met for a second. Was it the sound of the tires on the roadway? She didn't think it could be. The road had been freshly paved. It looked smooth, like black licorice. Without warning, the wheels began to shake. Crap, Dan said, moving his gaze to the rearview mirror. Boat trailer must be dragging that back tail light. It was loose when the dealer sold it to me, said he'd fix it. I need to pull over for a second, guys. Just as the car and the trailer stopped, it suddenly turned dark, as if Liz's mother had pulled her blackout shades against one of her all-too-frequent migraines. It would always be difficult to accurately place what happened in those moments when the wall of water first hit the front of the station wagon. It was fast and fierce. Liz and the boys screamed. Everything was staccato in her eyes. Dan's terrified face, the rising water, even the roaring sound emanating from outside seemed to come in pops or flashes. Dan, who had not yet opened his door, yelled, "Hang on! Flash flood!" The vehicle lurched from its resting spot. It was a cork. It was a feather. The force of the water shoved it back down the highway. Bumper pool, a steel ball in a pinball machine. The station wagon and the boat trailer careened back down the highway. Dan stretched his arm over to Liz as though he could protect her. Washing machine. Dryer with shoes inside. Liz looked out her window, and the boat trailer appeared next to her before snapping off and hurtling away with the dark water, along with logs and what might have been a capsized horse trailer. All of it passed in the kind of frightening blur that doesn't allow the mind to fully comprehend what one is seeing. Shards of memory. Debris of all kinds pelted them as they rattled backward down the highway. Liz was wondering if that had really been a horse trailer when, through the filthy windshield, she could suddenly make out the image of an immense horse as it lunged at them. Its hooves hit the glass, and the animal let out a terrified scream, the likes of which Liz would never forget, but never be able to describe no matter how hard she tried. It was sharp and guttural at the same time. After hitting the windshield, the animal rolled over the top of the station wagon. Were they underwater now? It was impossible to tell. Then a small red car was coming at them, at the last instant sweeping to Liz's side of the station wagon. A young woman pressed her hands against the window and called out for help as she passed. Her eyes were more white than blue, so open and full of terror. She was young, maybe still in her teens. Her gaze caught Liz's for a second before turning back to wherever the churning water would take her. Liz screamed, "We have to help her!" The roar of the water outside the car obliterated her words. Sleeping bags, a cooler, a child's dinosaur-shaped flotation device roared past the Ford in a soupy mixture of water, mud, foam, and all of the things that lake-goers would have enjoyed throughout a lazy day on the shore. The pod off the top of the car had dislodged and split open, sending suitcases, clothing, and backpacks into the torrent that carried away everything in the road that had become a spillway. And then, finally, the station wagon stopped. It had come to rest, listing on an outcropping that had been blasted into the basalt when the road to the lake had been forged. Now that their progress had halted, the pace of the flood outside flew into a much higher gear. Every few seconds, the water surged against one side of the car or the other, sometimes with enough force to rock the vehicle on its perch. "Everyone okay?" Dan yelled out. Liz, who had somehow ended up in the back seat with the boys, was the first to respond. "Something's wrong with Seth," she said, shaking as water began to pour inside.